Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. You are joining this public Land Justice Futures event, Palestine, Israel, the Church, and U.S. Empire, Understanding This Moment on the Front Lines. Today, we're going to be having a conversation about Israel's occupation, siege, and bombardment of Palestine, and what we need to understand about the current situation. And we'll be doing that with Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg and Palestinian-American Mennonite organizer Jonathan Brenneman. We'll learn about the ways that Christian Zionism and European white supremacy has shaped the current crisis, and how U.S. imperialism is now the driving force of its violence. We'll discuss the similarities and nuances between settler colonialism and manifest destiny here in the U.S., and settler colonialism and Zionism in Palestine, as well as why and how we can disrupt these ongoing projects of dispossession and dehumanization. During this webinar, we ask that you remain on mute apart from the Q&A section at the end. We also ask that the chat be used in moderation so that participants can focus on listening to the expertise of our esteemed speakers. We are a C3 organization, and as such, we cannot and will not support, endorse, or oppose any political candidate for elected office, and we won't be engaging with any commentary therefore. So just want to name that. And any statements that speakers make represent themselves, and we ask speakers to adhere to these same guidelines in this space. And to begin, we'd like to ground in what's been happening and why we're here. The statements I'm about to make are distressing and involve descriptions of violence. Over the last 6 months, Palestinians have been under an escalated assault by the Israeli military in retaliation for the attack on October 7th by Hamas's Qassam brigades that killed over 1,000 people and took about 250 captive, with now about 130 hostages still in Gaza. It's important to note that this crisis did not start on October 7th, as Palestinians have been living under 75 years of occupation and forced displacement, along with decades of siege, illegal settlements, sporadic wars, and apartheid. Israel's assault on Gaza has killed over 33,300 Palestinian people, including more than 14,000 children. Thousands more are missing under the rubble of collapsed buildings and infrastructure and are presumed dead. Over 7,000 Palestinians from the West Bank have been imprisoned since October 7th, many under administrative detention, and many of them children being held without charge or trial. It's not known how many Palestinians in Gaza have been taken prisoner. And we have seen civilians lining up to receive food and water killed en masse by the Israeli military, not once, but several times. There are also reports and evidence of many extrajudicial assassinations of civilians with hands tied. Let's all take a breath. We're practicing staying present with intense suffering. UNICEF estimates that at least 17,000 Palestinian children are currently unaccompanied or separated from their parents in Gaza. And some 1.7 to 1.9 million people, or more than 80% of Gaza's population, have been internally displaced. Many have been forced to stay in makeshift camps or the streets, exposed to Israeli air attacks. Over 190 aid workers, 484 healthcare workers, and close to 100 journalists have been killed. There's also been immense destruction of the land and place itself. About 38 to 48% of tree cover and farmland in Gaza has been destroyed. Olive groves and farms have been bulldozed. Soil and groundwater are contaminated by munitions and toxins. The air is unsafe to breathe with smoke and particulate matter. And so much of what is essential for human life to exist in a place, things like housing and water and food systems, schools, healthcare, civic and cultural centers, churches and mosques, have been destroyed. Palestinians in Gaza are at risk of dying of starvation, as Israel is denying access to food convoys. Several NGOs and human rights groups have pointed out that the Israeli government is using starvation as a weapon of war. Let's take another breath together. We are practicing letting this violence galvanize us into solidarity. The International Court of Justice has ruled there is a plausible case that Israel's actions in Palestine are a genocide, as international law and human rights scholars all around the world have sounded the alarms about since October. And the UN Security Council passed a ceasefire resolution, but contrary to the binding Security Council resolution, the Israeli government continues to bomb Gazan homes, hospitals, refugee camps, and has stated it has set a date for a ground invasion of Rafah. Meanwhile, the US is complicit in this violence. Congress passed a budget bill in March that includes a prohibition for a whole year on funding UNRWA, the main aid distribution organization for refugees in Palestine. It is illegal under international law for a nation to block necessary humanitarian aid, and it is against US law for US funding to go to any state actors that are blocking US aid. Despite all of this, the US government continues to give funding and weapons to Israel. Israel has received more US military aid and more US aid of any type than any other country since World War II, bypassing congressional approval since October 7th to send bombs, fighter jets, ammunition, and military equipment to Israel. So those are some of the facts. We are hosting this webinar because we care about what's happening in Palestine and Israel, and we know it's important to our work here in the US. As Land Justice Futures, we work with religious communities to pursue land justice. And together we reckon with the history of Euro-Christian supremacy that we've inherited and the resulting racial and ecological violence that has played out on US soil. And we do that and then imagine how we and Women Religious can help heal those stories and relationships. With our focus on repairing the harms of colonialism in the US, some may wonder why we're offering a webinar about what's going on the other side of the world. Our response is that Palestine is an acute frontline for the struggles against colonialism, imperialism, and war. And if we stand for reparative works, land justice, and self-determination for indigenous peoples here, we must resist when our country is actively repeating the history and violence of colonialism elsewhere. Palestine has become a symbol for the global South and indigenous movements around the world for life and freedom and self-determination. And as said by Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, I want to see a liberated world. The ground zero of that liberated world is Palestine. It is the last great direct colonial occupation in all its rawness. To illustrate this point, I'll share a quote from Crystal Tubles, the executive director of Honor the Earth. She's an Oglala Lakota and Northern Cheyenne woman, and also a former advisor to Land Justice Futures. And she was talking about the campaign to rematriate land that she was in charge of with NDN Collective. And she said, "Since day one of the Land Back campaign, I made it a campaign priority to be in solidarity with our Palestinian relatives. It was Palestinians who showed up at Standing Rock and selflessly shared how to run a boycott campaign. And it was Palestinians who sat with me as I cried, reflecting on how colonization has harmed my people. The moment I heard stories about the intentional burning of olive trees, much like the killing of our buffalo to break our spiritual connection to our four-legged relatives and the land, I knew this struggle would be my struggle. We are 500 years into colonization. Palestinians are 74 years in. When they win and return to their homelands, we as Native peoples are closer to our freedom, liberation, and sovereignty. Right now, many of the same colonial tactics we study and witness from US history are unfolding in real time in Palestine. And while some of the context is different, some of it is also simple. The killing, forced removal, and occupation of a people is wrong and must be stopped. And as we work to heal our own history and the way it's shaped our present day conditions, we seek to be in service of healing and life right now. So that's what we're here. That's why we're here. And that's what we're going to learn and talk about together. We're going to move into a prayer led by Rabbi Rosenberg and our discussion. But before we do, we want to just root in our shared humanity and the real sense of what's at stake. It's been 6 months of harrowing news, and it's way too easy to become desensitized and to normalize the devastation with numbers and recurring headlines. And so to ground us in the humanity and power and resilience of the Palestinian people, we're going to watch a short poem by Palestinian poet Rafif Ziadah called "We Teach Life, Sir." And I think Brittany is going to cue that up. Thank you, Brittany.
They're coming on full screen for folks.
Looks good. Thanks, Brittany.
I'll start with this poem. I wrote this poem when the bombs were dropping on Gaza, and I was the media spokesperson for the coalition, doing a lot of the organizing. And we had stayed up to about 6 o'clock in the morning, perfecting every soundbite. And by the end, if you're Palestinian, you know most Palestinians get tired and start pronouncing our P's as B's. So we become Palestinians by the end of the day. So I was practicing my P's all night. And the next morning, one of the journalists asked me, "Don't you think it would all be fine if you just stopped teaching your children to hate?" I did not insult the person. I was very polite. But I wrote this poem as a response to these types of questions we Palestinians always get. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits, filled enough with statistics to counter measured response. And I perfected my English and I learned my UN resolutions. But still, he asked me, "Ms. Ziadah, don't you think everything would be resolved if you would just stop teaching so much hatred to your children?" Pause. I look inside of me for strength to be patient, but patience is not at the tip of my tongue as the bombs drop over Gaza. Patience has just escaped me. Pause. Smile. We teach life, sir. Rafif, remember to smile. Pause. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians teach life after they have occupied the last sky. We teach life after they have built their settlements and apartheid walls. After the last skies, we teach life, sir. But today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits. And just give us a story, a human story. You see, this is not political. We just want to tell people about you and your people. So give us a human story. Don't mention that word apartheid and occupation. This is not political. You have to help me as a journalist to help you tell your story, which is not a political story. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. How about you give us a story of a woman in Gaza who needs medication? How about you? Do you have enough bone-broken limbs to cover the sun? Hand me over your dead and give me the list of their names in 1,200 word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits and move those that are desensitized to terrorist blood. But they felt sorry. They felt sorry for the cattle over Gaza. So I give them UN resolutions and statistics, and we condemn and we deplore and we reject. And these are not two equal sides, occupier and occupied, and 100 dead, 200 dead, and 1,000 dead. And between that war crime and massacre, I vent out words and smile, not exotic, smile, not terrorist. And I recount 100 dead, 200 100 dead, 1,000 dead. Is anyone out there? Will anyone listen? I wish I could wail over their bodies. I wish I could just run barefoot in every refugee camp and hold every child, cover their ears so they wouldn't have to hear the sound of bombing for the rest of their life the way I do. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre, and let me just tell you, there is nothing your UN resolutions have ever done about this, and no soundbite I come up with, no matter how good my English gets, no soundbite will bring them back to life. No soundbite will fix this. We teach life, sir. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life, sir.
Thank you, Rafif, for that poem. And thank you, Brittany, for sharing it. I'd like to bring up Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg to support us in an opening prayer.
Thank you, Sarah. I think we just heard one opening prayer, so I just want to hold some silence for those words to land. With profound humility, offering some of my own words of prayer, I want to invite folks to take whatever posture is a posture of prayer for you. Breath of all life, source of wisdom, ground of knowing, thank you. Thank you for bringing us to this moment, for keeping us alive to this moment and turning us towards each other. I want to first ask that we let this moment of being together infuse us. In this time of continued genocide on Turtle Island and in Palestine, it's profoundly humbling to be together in sacred community of comrades who are turning towards each other and committing to fight for life. I pray that in being together, we can deepen our knowing, our understanding, strengthen us to face the profoundly devastating truth of this moment, of the systems that we are living inside of the harm that we are perpetrating, of the harms that we are surviving. May this time of learning and connecting together open us to be able to hold more deeply what is true. And may this opening weave us together to be more clear, more courageous, may our time together serve the fights for all walls to come down, for all empires to fall, for all people, for all children and adults and trees to live. Let this galvanize us into solidarity. Let this light a fire inside us for justice. let this grow our strength and commitment to continuing to support the struggle for justice in Palestine so that Palestinians may live, so that we all may live. May we make our way through this doorway together. Thank you for opening us. And I'll just invite you to any words that I didn't say that are your gratitude for this time, your hopes and prayers for this time, to whisper them to yourself, to share them in the chat. May there never be one voice praying. May we always be a cacophony, praying and singing and shouting and organizing together.
Well, amen. Thank you, Jessica, for that prayer. Thank you for asking us all to pour our prayers together into this moment. I'm gonna, thank you for bringing all the people here. We've got Jonathan and Jessica with us today. I'm gonna briefly introduce them right now. We have Jonathan Brenneman with us. He is a Mennonite Palestinian-American organizer with Christians for a Free Palestine. He has worked on the ground with Palestinian and Israeli peacemakers through community and formerly Christian Peacemaker Teams Palestine, CPT, project in Hebron, and has worked with the Mennonite Church to write and pass and implement the Peace in Israel and Palestine Resolution. Jonathan completed a master's degree in peace studies at Notre Dame's Kroc Institute, working with a South African organization which advocates for more just land policies. Notre Dame, that's what that is. Jonathan's work connects the Palestinian decolonial struggle with those of other indigenous peoples and challenges theologies of domination. And we have Rabbi Jessica Rosenberg with us as well. And she is a Reconstructionist rabbi devoted to her people's diverse and nuanced histories and to creating spaces, ritual, and organizing that helps transform our relationships to past, present, and future. She serves on the Rabbinical Council for Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, and has worked as a national organizer at Bend the Arc, Jewish Action, as well as a collective member of the Radical Jewish Calendar Project. She authored an introduction to trauma, healing, and resilience for rabbis, Jewish organizers and educators, or educators and organizers. And her just released book, for times such as these, A Radical's Guide to the Jewish Year. So welcome, Jonathan and Jessica. Thank you for being with us. I think that we should just get started with asking you about your relationships to Palestine and Israel and your personal connection to this place and these peoples. And Jonathan, maybe if you want to get started.
Thank you. It's good to gather with you all. In my bio, you mentioned I am a Palestinian Christian, so my family's roots there go very deep. We sometimes like to kid my great-great-great-grandmother's babysat Jesus. So have been tied to that place very deeply.
Oh, me now? Yeah. So my relationship to that place, as a US born Jew, I was taught to see myself as connected to the state of Israel, without any real cultural connection experience there, in a way that I have come to over my life need to deeply unpack. And in my adult life, as I'm separating Judaism from Zionism in a way that we're going to get into today, I see my ethical commitments and my responsibility as a spiritual ethical person inheriting a tradition of working for justice for all, necessitating solidarity with Palestinian people and the liberation of Palestinian land. And one of the things we can talk about today is, my spiritual tradition is that I face Jerusalem to pray 3 times a day. That's a 2,000-year-old tradition. And also that is profoundly different than supporting the modern nation state of Israel. And so when I face Jerusalem to pray, I'm praying for all the people of that land to be safe and free, and in particular for Palestinian struggle for liberation and supporting Palestinian struggles for justice and liberation and reparations.
Thank you both. Well, we titled this with a title that includes words like the church. And so I just want to dive right into, I think, a topic that unfortunately a lot of people don't know enough about, which is Christian Zionism. And I'm hoping maybe, Jonathan, we can start with you. If you can share, what is Christian Zionism, and can you briefly place it in historical context? And I know that this is a really big question, but I also know that you can do it.
I'll try to just give the shortened answer here. There's a lot of ways, and there's not a one definition that everyone uses. Today, when I talk about Christian Zionism, I'll be talking about Christian support for the current nation state of Israel out of a belief that the Bible teaches that Israel is uniquely favored by God. Now, I find this to be a racist concept, just even at face value. The idea that nations are ordained by God and not a human construct, and that God has favorites and least favorites, is deeply problematic and part of a long line of racist Christian theology. And I think Christian Zionism is squarely in that. I won't go through the whole lineage, but just to name a few things that, like, Christian Zionism comes out of Britain during the height of its colonial empire, and it is a theology that was very deeply tied to the colonial mindset of the time. It predates Jewish political Zionism by a few decades. So when you talk about the idea that Jews should leave Europe specifically and colonize Palestine, that idea was a Christian one that was rooted in racist and anti-Semitic Christian theologies. I'll just stop there because I could go on.
Well, and I think we will. I guess one thing to name here, like you mentioned, Christian Zionism predating Jewish Zionism. Jessica, can you share a little bit about what is Jewish Zionism? How is it different, and place that in its own historical context? And then just after that, if we can have a conversation about what is the relationship between these two, and what was the church's role, or Christianity's role, in the establishment of the state of Israel, and how has that evolved?
Yeah, so as Jonathan said, like, the idea of a modern nation state in Israel as a political movement was and a kind of like that like kind of combined modern European nationalism with different kinds of religious supremacy, Christian supremacy, Jewish supremacy, or Christian supremacy that then played on Jewish supremacy within our own tradition, like that was kind of like first came from Christians, and it landed in a context of European Jews who had been facing anti-Semitism in different forms for many centuries. And in the moment in the 19th century when European countries were forming and kind of like deciding who is a citizen or not, it was not a given that Jews would have rights, like in modern European nation states. And so there were movements in the 19th century European Jewish life to say, am I back? Okay. There were debates among European Jewish thinkers in that time. I'm gonna like really over summarize a few decades here. But there were some folks that were saying like, okay, we can assimilate into Christian European mainstream, like lose our Jewishness and to become full citizens of modern European nation states. And then there were some folks that were saying like, they'll never have us, and like looking at continued anti-Semitism against assimilated Jews as proof that Jews would never be fully accepted in Christian dominant countries, and that is part of really one of the things that galvanized a modern political movement for originally for like a nation state somewhere, and there were other places that were on the table. Theodor Herzl, the father of modern political Zionism, was not sold on historic Palestine as the place. He was ready to like make a deal with whoever would give some land for European Jews to colonize. But yeah, so he kind of like brought this movement and started organizing in the 1890s, 1897, I think, but was the first World Zionist Congress. And what I'll say is that it was not popular. Like for the next 50 years or so, it competed with movements towards assimilating into modern nation states, and also political movements like the Bund, a Jewish movement towards like we stay and fight for revolution for in the places where we are, to like overthrow the empires in the places that we live, and we're part of broad-based movements, and not we go somewhere else and make a nation state. So like politically there was a robust discussion about that was really about kind of like Jewish safety in Europe, that was completely decimated after the Holocaust. Like literally the people who were fighting to stay in Europe were killed by the Nazi Holocaust. And at that moment, the argument that a nation state and a military would be the only viable path to Jewish safety, like that became, as you can imagine, much more popular. And also there weren't a lot of choices at that moment. The US did not, by and large, open its doors to refugees and survivors of the Holocaust. Instead, people were sent, whether they wanted to or not, many of them, to Israel. All of that political history of Jewish Zionism is on top of, as I opened with, a relationship. Like if you read the Hebrew Bible, if you know anything about Jewish prayer life, there is a spiritual connection to that land. And for 2000 some years, there was a spiritual connection to that land that did not involve moving there, mass mobilizations to move there, or trying to conquer it, or trying to displace anyone else from that land. In fact, there was a really strong understanding that like actually Jewish return to that land wouldn't happen by human moves, that would be a Mashiach, that would be a spiritual messianic movement. And there definitely were some movements to move back to the land, but they were minimal and did not gain popular power for centuries and centuries. So, and I think as people of faith, like one of the things that and also maybe I just want to name, and I'm doing a longer answer than Jonathan did. I hope that's okay. Then Jonathan's going to talk a lot more. Just to name that there have always been Jews living in that land for as long as there's been Jewishness. For Jews of historic Palestine were by and large living in good relations with their neighbors, with their non-Jewish, with their Muslim and Christian neighbors, and not seeking to dominate. The European movement, Zionism as a European-led movement, erases Mizrahi history. Mizrahi is a politicized term for Jews of historic Palestine and other lands in that region. And European Jews who created the modern nation state of Israel set up a system of like European racism for which Jews who actually like are of that land are at the bottom of the like social hierarchy, social, political, economic hierarchy in many ways, or that's been true over the decades. So just to say, like, part of what, as people of faith, to come back around and say that we can acknowledge Jewish relationship to that land and life in that land, and also separate out colonization and the movement for a militarized nation state with Jewish supremacy, which is what Zionism is.
Thank you for all of that. I'm curious, Jonathan, if you could just expand more upon some of what Jessica shared around just the relationship between Christian Zionism and what came out of the Holocaust as a more popular movement of Jewish Zionism, and just how I think it'd be helpful for some folks in our audience to really understand more about like the specific role that Christian Zionism had in the establishment of the state of Israel.
Yeah, for sure. Just to go off what Rabbi Jessica was saying, and really to highlight, like, Christian European anti-Semitism is one of the major contributions to kind of Zionism winning the argument within Jewish spaces about how to respond to nationalism. And that's something that, for the Christians in this audience, I think it's really important to think about. I remember having a conversation with Reverend Mitri Raheb, a Palestinian minister, and he said, he was speaking to a US American audience, and he said, "Why do we as Palestinian Christians have to pay the price for your anti-Semitism? Please stop making us do that. Actually take responsibility for your anti-Semitism and don't put it on us. Don't be silent about the oppression that we are going into because you perpetuated anti-Semitism to such an extreme degree." So that's one way that I think we as Christians are complicit in the violence and colonization happening right now. I also want to name, like, even prior to the Holocaust, you look at Jewish Zionism was very weak politically in Europe as far as a movement, but Christian Zionism actually had a lot of power. You have British prime ministers who were presiding over historic Palestine who believed these Christian Zionist ideas. Lord Balfour, who famously gave the British Empire's backing to the Zionist movement, was himself both a Christian Zionist as well as a staunch anti-Semite who was looking for a way to get Jews out of Britain, and really gave, like, the power of the British Empire and put it behind the Jewish Zionist movement. So Christians played a huge role both in the foundation of the state of Israel, in creating the horrific circumstances for Zionism to flourish and to be able to justify the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And this is something that continues to this day with the way that Christian Zionists dehumanize Palestinians and use Israel towards their political ends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in reading some of Mitri Raheb's book, or works, it's become really helpful to understand like that the establishment of the state of Israel on the part of British Christian Zionists like was kind of a solution to several things that were of their own interests, namely, pushing European Jews out of Western Europe, out of Britain, out of immigrating from Eastern Europe to Western nation states, as well as like trying to appease their guilt about the Holocaust using Palestinians as kind of the scapegoat for that, or not the scapegoat, but like as the collateral for that. And then third, like these ideas that you mentioned around Christian Zionism that were popular within, British politician circles and leaders around, the second coming of Christ. And can you just speak briefly to like this aspect of Christian Zionism? Because I don't think, personally, I didn't, I grew up Catholic and I didn't know about this. I don't think it's as understood within Catholic circles, or maybe it is, but I think it might be growing in some of its popularity within Christian or conservative Catholics, as well as, so can you just place it a little bit within Christianity as a whole and what those beliefs are?
Yeah, I didn't talk too much about what the theology actually says or is based on. So I was sharing how it really came up at the height of British imperial power. And the idea was that the Bible wasn't a, like, I don't know, a book of poems and stories historically. It wasn't ethical teachings. It was a book that you could use for fortune telling. And basically, you take the stories from the Bible, and the idea was, it was called dispensationalism. So that was a dispensation. You're going to have a repeat of that with some slightly different characters, and then another repeat of that with different characters. So in the Bible, the Hebrews are the chosen people, and now we're in a dispensation where the church is the chosen people. So you have supersessionism baked in right there. And then there's going to be another dispensation. And so they were looking at, the belief was, well, we as Christians, our role is to create a Jewish state in historic Palestine in order to bring about the next dispensation. And we have to be good, God's Christian soldiers marching onto war to bring about these ideas. And specifically, the next dispensation is when Jesus is going to come back and there's going to be the rapture, and all of the Christians will get to go to heaven. Well, sorry, all of the Protestants will get to go to heaven. Everyone who's not Protestant will go to hell, including all of the Jews that Christian Zionists help send to Palestine. So obviously this is a theology that most seminaries today would scoff at. However, it was extremely popular in the early 20th century and really connected in with the US fundamentalist movement. And particularly in 1948, when the state of Israel was established, and then in 1967, when Israel colonized Jerusalem, the Christian Zionists could say, or the fundamentalists could say, look, we were right. We predicted that that Jews would take over the Holy Land, and they did. And so we're right about all of this other stuff, including that interracial marriage is a sin, that schools shouldn't be integrated, that women shouldn't have rights, that gay people should be damned to hell, like all of these really awful ideas that were also part of that. One of the ways that these fundamentalists like pushed their agenda and said we're right is through their Christian Zionism, and through the idea that they predicted what happened in Palestine. And to this day, you see Christian Zionists try to like manipulate the story about what's happening in Palestine, because most people don't pay that much attention to what's happening in Palestine. So it's pretty easy in this culture to shift the story a little bit and make it seem like, oh, look, all of these prophecies are coming true. That's one major aspect of how Christian Zionism works. Another is even more simple, and it's the one that groups like Christians United for Israel with Pastor John Hagee, the largest pro-Israel organization in the US, has used. They said, in the Bible, it says, God says, I will bless those who bless you, talking to Abraham. They say that means Israel gets all of those promises, and it's basically prosperity gospel. If you want to be rich, if you want God's blessings of money, then bless Israel with your political support. And they don't go into all of the like dispensationalist theology and stuff. They just, if you hear John Hagee speak, he will just use that verse and pretty much only that verse and continue to say it over and over again. God will bless those who bless you, and use it as a way to get Christians to support Israel. And support Israel's most harmful policies, because for Christian Zionists, it's important that Israel remains a Jewish supremacist state, that Muslim holy places are destroyed, that non-Jews are ethnically cleansed from the land, and that there's more war, right? Like they even see peace, they see the UN as the Antichrist. Yeah.
Thank you for that context. I think it's really helpful for those who are less familiar with Christian Zionism. You know, I think it's important to acknowledge, like, this is a massive political force in our country. Like, there are so many more Christian Zionists in the US than there are Jews in the world. And they make up a very significant, force in our country's policies. Just if we could briefly just touch on, is there anything else you would like to add about like how you think Christian Zionism just might show up in more subtle or insidious ways, you know, especially for those who don't believe in some of the things that you're naming? Like, what are ways that we might not even realize that we are perpetuating Christian Zionism, even if we're not Christian Zionists?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a little hard to talk about Christian Zionism because when you get into like the bits and pieces of the theology, it seems so weird, yet it has had an incredible influence on the US Christianity. Like I think every denomination, Catholics included, even though it has a lot of anti-Catholic ideas deep-seated in that theology, have been influenced by this. US general culture, I think, has been influenced by this. A recent poll showed about a quarter of US Americans believe that Israel, the modern nation state of Israel, is a fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Now, it's a pretty central tenet of Christian Zionism. While most Americans would not call themselves Christian Zionists, or I doubt that 25% would, like that idea has been deeply seated and connects into a lot of other kind of US exceptionalism, right? Like there's a lot of connection there. I also think that the theology has very easily perpetuated because there hasn't been much of an alternative, and there hasn't been as much taught. So that's why webinars like this are very important. Yeah, I'll stop there. Rabbi Jessica, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I learn so much from you, Jonathan, every time we talk, or get to talk together. Yeah, I mean, I think there is also, I'm really just riffing on this one. Like, there's Christian Zionism, like TM, capital C, capital Z, and then there's also like the Zionism that is kind of like in the water in US foreign policy that then like Christians are also part of, kind of like furthering without necessarily knowing it. So, and I think that, yeah, I'm curious what you would say about this, Jonathan, and other folks on here. Like, I think that even among like liberal, for lack of a better term, or like liberal progressive leaning Christians, like, in the same as they're, you know, in like Jewish communities that are like wouldn't say, you know, like the family I was raised in, like would not have said we were Jewish supremacists, but would have said like, you know, the two-state solution idea of like separate states for Jews and Palestinians, like that's the way forward, which is a concept that accepts anti-Semitism as inevitable, and creates ethnic, religious nation states as like an acceptable, as if like progressives like that's something we want to get on board with, like nation states that are that, you know, that have like ethnic, religious, cultural, you know, dominance, and racialized hierarchies, instead of working to end those. And I think like yeah, I don't know whether we want to like, I'm not, I don't know that that falls under the umbrella of Christian Zionism, but it is a like thing that perpetuates the status quo in Israel that I want to, you know, kind of like be opening and challenging on this call.
Totally. Yeah. And figuring out how to talk about that, like it's tough. Like, for example, and I know 501(c)(3) and stuff, like Joe Biden calls himself a Zionist and he is a Christian. When he talks about his motivations for being a Zionist, they're not theological exactly. They're imperial, right? Like he has literally said the US would have to invent an Israel to do the US's bidding in the Middle East. He wants Israel as a colonial outpost. That is his self-described motivation for being a self-described Zionist, right? Like, I'm sure that ties in with the colonial Christian concepts at some point, but like it's not quite the same, and it has a lot of the same results. And so like how do we also reckon with that, I think is a really important question. Yeah, as Christians. And that's why for me the alternative to Christian Zionism or challenging Christian Zionism is not so much like telling the Christian Zionists they're wrong. It's just having a strong and powerful Christian voice that is calling for freedom, justice, and equality. And that's what Christians for a Free Palestine is.
Thanks for plugging. You mentioned, you know, this move towards the US having an interest, a political and economic interest in having an outpost, having a colonial outpost in the Middle East. I think it's important to name that in terms of like the reasons why the West has supported the state of Israel have evolved. And so, you know, as the, you know, decades have gone on, like that, the role of Israel within US empire has shifted and become quite central. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to just the US role in this right now. And I guess just kind of more broadly, like, you know, I hear so many people around me, especially Catholics and Christians, talk about this struggle as if it has nothing to do with them. You know, as if it's something that's far away. It's often framed as this centuries-old struggle between Muslims and Jews for the same land. They see it referred in textbooks and in the news media as the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Israel-Hamas war. And so I want to, you know, ask this question of like, what do these kinds of ideas or explanations or language miss that's crucial to understand, specifically around the US role?
You start.
Okay. I mean, I feel like we already hit some of those aspects before, so I don't want to repeat on those. I think that, yeah, I mean it, and in your intro, Sergey, you made it so clear that you know the U.S. is backing a genocide right now, and that's something that we have to reckon with as U.S. Americans, and that we have to challenge in every way that we can. I was quite inspired today to see like multiple airports, bridges, everything. People are shutting down, recognizing that that's what we need to be doing in this moment. I think Okay, I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question, but I'm going to use this moment to just bring this in. I think one of the reasons why the US tends to be so pro-Israel is because our stories are very similar. Our national myths are very similar, and they're both connected to religious supremacy as a part of colonization. I often speak on Christian Zionism and the doctrine of discovery and the connections there. And Israel replicates that a lot, and Christian Zionism particularly replicates that. Like it's in the same strand. I'm often reminded of indigenous author Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States. She references 4 examples of covenant nations as a particular type, particularly pernicious type of settler colonialism. She talks about the English colonization of Ireland. She talks about the Boers colonization of South Africa. She talks about the European colonization of Turtle Island or North America. And she talks about the Israeli colonization of Palestine. And so what she means by covenant nation is the idea that God gave a certain group of people this land and gave them the mandate to colonize it, making the indigenous people non-peoples, whether that's terra nullius or a land without a people for a people without a land, which, by the way, is a phrase that was coined by a Christian Zionist before Jewish Zionism was even political Zionism was even established. And so I think that recognizing the ways that the oppression that the US puts upon indigenous and Black people on this continent is very deeply connected to the oppression that US Americans are pushing, the US back occupation and now genocide of Palestinians is really important for us to reckon with, and is helpful for us to know, like, we don't have to work on all of these different things. It's actually like you work on dismantling white Christian supremacy, you're working on all of this stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I mean, I would just add, in thinking about, how we talk about this and how this is connected to us in the US, to talk about our tax dollars here on April 15th. And billions of dollars every year of US tax dollars going to fund to fund the Israeli war machine. Much of that, like the majority of that, is earmarked, it like actually gets spent with US companies, and that is like built in. And so this is something like, as we're a group of people unlearning anti-Semitism and how we talk about what's happening in Israel Palestine, like a lot of times people talk about when people talk about the like political lobbying that influences US foreign policy, just to like talk about the war machine and weapons manufacturers and US and military industrial complex as like part of what is a big part of like who is profiting from this, and what keeps it going. And I think that's something that like in this time, many people are getting like more, are learning a lot more about and getting more specific and articulate at saying kind of like, oh, this is like how much of my tax are like this city, this county, this state, like this is what could be funded here. The number of hospitals and schools and roads that could be here, but instead is being used to bomb all of those things in, hospitals and schools and roads in Gaza. And to say that like, the idea that that happens out of US politicians really caring about Jewish safety, it is like a deeply profitable for them in the US war machine calculation, that is important for us to talk about. And I think this is like when talking about like how to frame it. I think part of like nowadays, or it, like there's definitely a lot of people in the US that would say like this is a Christian country and say that proudly. And then in other places it's more hidden that the US is a Christian nationalist project. But I think one of the things that's like, how do we connect it to us here is to say and how do we like kind of change the centuries old Jewish Muslim thing is to like talk about the US as a Christian imperialist project, to talk about India and Hindutva and Hindu nationalism that is decimating Kashmir and killing Muslims, and you know like and to say like actually you know, and to call on the history of like Christian connection to empire going back to the Crusades, like to say like it's you know like this is an ancient, or not ancient, this is a many centuries old struggle about religious supremacy being tied to empire and then being used to profit the few, you know, the you know, for elites to profit and to mobilize masses around like religious supremacy and racism that then decimates the land, decimates life, and profits elites. And that's not specific to, unfortunately, it would be a lot easier to defeat if only one tradition or religion or culture had that. But it turns out like everybody is able to do that, and none of our traditions have yet been proved to be like empire proof. And so we actually have to like work to create traditions, you know, to like live our, you know, our sacred teachings and traditions in ways that upend empire and supremacy. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for making that connection between like using religious ideas and fervor and identity to basically underwrite and give power towards, you know, economic empire and political empires, and the military industrial complex and its associated industries that are profiting off of this. And I just think it's so heartbreaking to think about, yeah, the money that could be used to build up society, to build up communities and support communities with what they need, like housing and schools and roads and infrastructure, is instead being used to bomb those very things. For and through that kind of those religious ideas and fervor, is just, it's deeply upsetting. I think for people who are spiritually committed and devoted beings, it feels like such a twisting of the sacred. I'm glad you brought up the doctrine of discovery, Jonathan. I'd love to just like talk a little bit more about that and just settler colonialism as a whole. You know, for folks who are part of you know, our community, we talk about the doctrine of discovery a lot. It's the papal bulls that were issued by the Vatican in the 15th century that justified the colonization of 84% of the earth, as well as the enslavement of African peoples, the land theft and genocide of indigenous peoples in North America and South America and around the world. Can you share a little bit about what connections you draw between the doctrine of Christian discovery and its kind of manifest destiny flavors, with just, if there's anything to add about this, and just in terms of what you know of the doctrine? Like, we met at the coalition to dismantle the doctrine of discovery conference, and so I'd love for you to share a little more about that.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I think they are deeply connected ideas, and for me, like Christian Zionism very much is like indebted to the doctrine of discovery. It is just another manifestation of the underlying ideas of the doctrine of discovery. Of course, I already talked about like the idea of terra nullius and a land without a people for a people without a land are just, it's the same idea. It's very much taken from the doctrine of discovery. Other ideas of domination, of like The word savage is used about Palestinians all the time. The word civilized, like there was an Israeli spokesperson who was just on the radio the other day, and he ended his time by saying, I want to remind you that this is a conflict between the civilized world and savages. Right? I'm just straight up doing that. And these are talking points that Christian Zionists use all the time. And the idea of just Christian supremacy in such a way that it makes everyone else subhuman, not just in the like terra nullius style, but also that, Jews can just be pawns in some end time game for Christian Zionists, that Palestinians don't actually have humanity. They are simply just obstacles to God's plan, including Palestinian Christians who just completely mess up their worldview because they don't even understand because duality thinking is also a big part. Like Christians are good guys, Palestinians are bad guys. So how do Palestinian Christians fit into this? And so I think what studying Christian Zionism like reminds me about the doctrine of discovery is that the ideologies of domination and empty land are still widely held amongst US Christians. The legacy of the doctrine of discovery is still very strong. Christian Zionism is just another colonial aspect of that. And those who hold dehumanizing views of Palestinians are the same people who hold dehumanizing views of indigenous peoples in the US as well. And I think, this is a slightly different point, but I think important. I've more recently often not even talked about Christian Zionism. I just talk about white Christian nationalism, because Christian Zionism is an aspect of that. It is generally the foreign policy of white Christian nationalists. Since 2016, since Trump's election, really galvanized by white Christian nationalists. There's been a lot written about them. Very little has talked about their foreign policy or the fact that they are some of the most staunchly pro-Israel people in the US, while also being holding some of the most anti-Semitic beliefs of people in the US. So it's, I think that aspect is also important and deeply connected to the legacy of the doctrine of discovery in this country.
Thank you. Jessica, I'm curious if you can chime in on this question. And I guess, I'll just name, there are different opinions that I hear, even among people who support a ceasefire, people who support Palestinian freedom, about whether the state of Israel is an example of settler colonialism. And I'd just love to ask you how you see it.
Yeah. I definitely think Israel is a settler colonial state. As I hopefully named in the history, it was Europeans, coming to create a state. And the fact that there is a spiritual connection to that land, like Christians colonizing this land of Turtle Island also claimed spiritual connection to, that this was the New Jerusalem, and like made a spiritual narrative to justify taking land.
They called it the New Zion.
Right, yeah.
Like straight up same thing. Sorry.
Yeah. So like, so, I think that's something that there's one of the weird moves of the last few years is this like claim from Zionists or people who want to support Israel that Jews are indigenous to that land, and that justifies a Jewish supremacist militarized nation state. And it's like, it's so painful because, like, as I've said, many Jews have lived there for generations. and there is a spiritual connection to that land. And Jews are a multiracial, multicultural people that over 2,000-3,000 years have like lived in diaspora since the origin of Jewishness, and have ties to all the lands that they've lived in, or that we've lived in, and have been like there are Jews who, and it kind of like messes with some of the language, like like there are Jews who have 1,000 years of ancestry in that place, and also I have none as far back as I know. I would have to really go into the mists of time to like have any connection to that land, and to say that my 1,000-year of Russian, like in Northern Europe are like indigenous to that land because we have a relationship to it, really corrupts both, I think, like the important like what indigeneity means, and also what is unique and special about Jewish relationship to, like, what I have actually learned about spiritual connection to land in my tradition, is about living in balance, not in dominance, like in stewardship, in cycles of care with the land. Everything about a militarized nation state that like is clearly like destroying life and land right now. Is the tools of settler colonialism, and then like part of what I think it was so interesting in your first question, Sarah, about like our relationship to that place, and we can't anymore have like at this time it's like so it had like, this is obviously not the most important thing, is that 30,000 plus people, Palestinians, have been killed, that the Nakba, that there's generations of Palestinians displaced, and like at the very, like many miles later, as far as things that the colonial project of Israel has done, is destroyed or like significantly shifted like what is the relationship of Jewish tradition to that land, which like is a sacred relationship that is like deeply undermined by modern political Zionism.
Anything you want to add to this question about that Jessica's named around how seeing this as a settler colonial project?
I mean, yeah, it absolutely is. Early Zionists connected with other European colonists to express how this was a colonial project, right? I mean, there are correspondences between early Jewish Zionists and Cecil Rhodes saying, you should support this because it's colonization, and that's what you're all about. And then I feel like this will probably help with this audience, but Rabbi Jessica, if I say anything that doesn't feel good, please correct me. I just think, like, as a Palestinian Christian, I recognize that European Christians had a deeply spiritual connection to Palestine and used it to colonize Palestine through the Crusades, and mistreated all Palestinians living there, particularly Jews and Muslims, but also Palestinian Christians as well. And I see no justification for Christian colonization of Palestine because of that spiritual connection. To this day, I had the privilege of going back to Palestine in May, and I couldn't help but notice that like all of these spaces in Jerusalem had French flags and German flags, and they are still under the control of the of those European governments, because it was European churches that were founded through the state as a way for European states to get a little piece of the Holy Land. And I was so angry, like I hadn't really noticed that before, and I was so angry about like just recognizing the various ways that Palestine has been colonized and is still being colonized by Christians, by European churches as well. And I think there's no justification for that. And I see that as somewhat of a corollary. Again, nothing is exactly the same, of the exploitation of Jewish religious connection to that land for a Jewish supremacist state.
Well, thanks for bringing in both of you, just like this relationship with land. I think just for this last question, you know, if you could tie in, like, why should people who care about land justice care about Palestine? And just like, what else do you want to say? You know, this is our last question. We don't have a ton of time left. So just what do you most want to say to this audience? What's missing from this conversation? What's most salient and like on your heart right now?
I can, I'll start so Jonathan has to finish. Yeah, wait, sorry. Okay, it's both about land and also just anything we want to say. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of imagining a world without borders and without nation states at all. And I think that part of our task as spiritual people of faith is to like not settle for the conditions, not let the conditions of right now like limit our imagination of what is possible. And so and I guess I would say that both there's two pieces of that, like both in relationship to land and how humans like move and live and thrive, that we have to like be able to imagine a totally different world. And that especially as the waters are rising and the fires are raging, and we see this like part of the move, the rising fascism is like very much around resources, like the Earth's body in crisis. And so I just like, but I'm kind of like, what can we as people of faith like imagine as far as another world that is possible. And also just to say, and I think Jonathan's already pointed to this, is like part of what fuels the continued justification of the genocide in Gaza is that this is the answer to anti-Semitism. And I think it's like profoundly the work of Christians to say, we're going to end anti-Semitism without you don't need, and Biden has said this, and that's kind of like, Jews wouldn't be safe without Israel, which is basically saying like, y'all are going to keep being anti-Semitic, like he's talking about you, like that's who makes us not safe, so I'm like, I would really love a movement of, Christians taking responsibility for Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, in addition to, racism and colonization, to say, we're going to fight for a world where all people can be safe where they live, and not settle that like Israel is like this is the answer, because it's not, it can't be. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I mean, part of the answer that I want to give to that first question is that indigenous communities all over the world are deeply in solidarity with the indigenous communities of Palestine right now, particularly, but historically as well. That was something that when I went to the Doctrine of Discovery conference, where it was this gathering of indigenous activists from all over the world, and Palestine was at the forefront of all of their minds. So if you're doing deep solidarity work with indigenous communities and looking at what land justice looks like to them, Palestine is usually part of that. Seeing the connections, seeing the ways that, you know, the colonial technologies that have been and continue to be used against indigenous communities in North America, in Australia, all over the world are being used against Palestinians and being developed against Palestinians these days. And I think that we've tried to show pretty clearly that Christians have long been part of the problem, have long contributed to the violence, colonization, and genocide of Palestinians. And if we can really understand that, if we can take that in, it's very powerful, because once you realize how you're part of the problem, it becomes a lot easier to become part of the solution. You don't have to change a lot of other things. You have a spot from your own communities to work from. And so, a group of us who were Christian and Christian adjacent activists recognized that the loudest Christian voices in this moment have been Christian Zionists who have been cheering on this genocide, and that there needs to be a different Christian voice. And so we started Christians for a Free Palestine. And our goal is to be a strong, powerful, unapologetic, liberatory Christian voice in response to Christian Zionism. And so you can learn more about what that means at our next mass call. We have calls every month, and so thank you for putting that in the chat. And whether it's with Christians for a Free Palestine or activating with other groups, the situation is dire right now, and we need everyone to be doing everything they can from any angle they can.
Mhm.
So please find a way to get involved, because you already are.
Thank you both. And we will be sending out follow-up with information about Christians for a Free Palestine, their next mass mobilizing call for April. And as well as want to ask that folks, talk about this webinar with your communities, with your families, with your roommates, with your coworkers, because it really is our responsibility to do what we can where we can in terms of recognizing the ways in which we are complicit in the problem. We are the problem. And so, as Jonathan says, once we realize that, we can become part of the solution. So yeah, we hope that these are some things that people can do in order to stand in solidarity with the movement for a Free Palestine, with the movement to live in a world that is free of colonization, occupation, and genocide. We'd love to have a little bit of time for folks to just kind of land in their own learning. So we're going to play some music for about 3 minutes, and we'd love it if folks could spend a couple of minutes just jotting down, what did I learn about how land justice connects to Palestine? And what is one commitment that you're going to make moving forward? We would love for folks to share that in the chat, at least that commitment that they're making within themselves. And so these two questions: what did I learn about? It could be anything, but also specifically how land justice connects to Palestine, and what is one commitment you can make moving forward? So we're just gonna play some music, and then we'll have a moment for sharing at the end, maybe one or two folks.
We breathe together. We breathe together. Stop the occupation. We breathe together. We breathe together. We breathe together. Stop the occupation. We breathe together. We breathe together. We breathe together. Stop the occupation. We march together. We march together. We march together. Stop the occupation. We grieve together. We grieve together. We grieve together. Stop the occupation. We strike together. We strike together. We strike together. Stop the occupation. Ceasefire. 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 Stop the occupation. Ceasefire. 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 Stop the occupation. We breathe together. We breathe together. We breathe together. Stop the occupation. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Stop the occupation. Ceasefire. 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 Stop the occupation. Ceasefire. 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 Stop the occupation. We breathe.
Thank you. That was Ceasefire, written by Adrienne Marie Brown and sung by the Rise Choir. Seeing as we only have about a minute left, I actually think that it's just really wonderful to read people's commitments in the chat. And so I'm grateful that to the folks who are naming these commitments here, commitments to keep learning and to calling on Congress, to talking about this with others, reflections on what people have been learning. Jonathan, I would love to ask you to close with a closing prayer or benediction. And thank you so much to both you and Rabbi Jessica for joining us. I feel like I speak for all of us when I say that we've learned a lot in these 90 minutes. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It's always a blessing to be with you and to be with Rabbi Jessica. I want to end with some words that are not mine, but are a benediction written by Sister Ruth Marlene Fox in around 1985. I adapted it slightly. May you be blessed with the restless discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may seek truth boldly and love deep within your heart. May you be blessed with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may tirelessly work for justice, freedom, and peace amongst all people. May you be blessed with tears to shed for those who suffer from pain, rejection, starvation, and the loss of all they cherish, so that you may reach out your hand to comfort them and transform their pain into joy. And may you be blessed with enough foolishness to believe that you really can make a difference in this world, so that you are able, by God's grace, to do what others claim cannot be done. Go in peace.